We've got a great guest this evening. Jack Rankin has been the Conservative Member of Parliament for Windsor since July 2024, previously served as a councillor on Windsor and Maidenhead Borough Council from 2015 to 2019. Interestingly, although we took an absolute beating in the general election in 2024, I think I'm right in saying that the largest cohort of Conservative MPs in terms of which general election they entered Parliament in is now actually the 2024 cohort. So before anybody leaps to the conclusion that the Conservative Party is finished and dead, it's a whole swathe of new talent that is actually our biggest grouping by election in the House of Commons. Before being elected to Parliament, with a degree in maths and physics under his belt, Jack worked in the energy market for 10 years. So he's one of those rarities, a dying breed of politicians who had a proper job before actually entering Parliament. And he's already made something of a name for himself as a rising star in the party, a strong proponent of what I think you could call traditional Conservative values, staunch belief in parliamentary sovereignty, freedom of speech, property rights, and the free market. In October 2024, Jack wrote, perhaps he was only half joking as well. He said, "I'm 32 years old and I've been married nearly 8 years. And sadly, sometimes it feels true that everybody under 40 who voted Conservative at the last election probably attended my wedding." So I might touch with him, or might touch on the point of what we need to do to win back the youth vote. But here to tell us what he'd do to turn that situation around, what he thinks of the state of the nation, the state of the party, and what we need to do about it. It's great to be joined by Jack Rankin. Jack, how the devil are you, sir? Really good of you to join us.
Thanks for having me, Mark. I'm very happy to be here with fellow Conservatives.
So it's great to have you. Well, let's kick off with, well, I mean, you know, you've been in for, what is it, 10 months now. Kind of, in general terms, you know, how are you finding it? Is it what you were expecting? Is it completely different? Is it better or worse? Is it more uplifting or more depressing? Give us a picture of your first near year in Parliament.
Yeah, I think you can give many varied answers to that, but I always try to give a positive one because, you know, I know how hard anybody who makes it to Parliament has worked to get here. You know, most of us have wanted to be an MP for 10, 20 years, if not more, most of our adult lives. And I know how many people slogged it out and have stood again and again for the party. And obviously the last election, frankly, was it's something of a massacre for us. So those of us who are here, I think, just have to remember that and be very grateful that we are the survivors. So and I get I'm in the position where I'm a non-London seat. I'm a London seat for the purposes of expenses, so I don't get a second home when I'm here. So I get the train to Waterloo every morning and walk over Westminster Bridge. And I've got to say that, and I hope you never lose this. But when you walk over Westminster Bridge with number 10 peering above you and kind of think this is where I'm going to work today, to try to make whatever little incremental distance is possible, and I think it is little and incremental at the minute. But that I still have that absolute awe. And when you talk to the old boys about it, and you say, you know, do you ever lose that? And they're kind of, it's a bit like retiring international sports people. They tell you that when you realise you don't have that awe for playing for England or whatever that is, that's the time to go. So yeah, I'm still in that.
So you still feel it's like your first time walking onto the hallowed Wembley grass every time you come out of Waterloo.
Yeah. And they say to you, the old boys, when that goes, then it's time to get out of the buildings. Very much have that. So yeah, very grateful to be one of the survivors of many of us who've worked long hard to get here, and still have that sense of overwhelming kind of wow, here we are.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not a politician, you know, so I don't have any powers like you do, but I've probably spent.
Oh, you think backbench MPs have powers, Mark?
Oh, no, okay, yeah, that was my first error of the evening. Quite right too. But yeah, I've obviously worked in the area. It still strikes me every time Big Ben comes into view. I mean, having been working in that postcode area for the best part of 30 years, I've tried to calculate how many family photo albums in Tokyo do I appear in, and it must be quite a high number, I would think. You've got to avoid all of the tourists. So you won Windsor. Most of the rest of the county. Are you the only Conservative MP in Berkshire now?
I am, yes. Yeah.
How did you pull off winning Windsor? What fell into place for you? And what generally in the surrounding area or across the country as a whole last July, what went wrong? You're right, it was a massacre. Losing 2/3 of your seats is extraordinary. And I know there have been endless postmortems of this, but I'd love your take on it.
Yeah, look, I think you could answer that question at almost any level, can't you? So, just in terms of the local and more parochial stuff, before maybe getting into the failings of the past Conservative government, the one thing that benefited me was that my predecessor retired early, and that allowed two things to happen. It allowed the association to select me in a full process, so as open to the membership as the Conservative Party rules allow. And also that allowed my selection to be quite timely. So I was selected, I think it was September, maybe even August 2020, let me get my years right now, 3. So I didn't live in the constituency at the time, so I had the chance to move to the constituency, and I had the chance to, build up a network of, simple things, deliverers, right? But also, get around community events. So, I had the chance to kind of not quite develop incumbency, but I certainly had the ability to build up some infrastructure, because the reality is a lot of these, what were called safe seats, is that, they've withered on the vine, right? So I had the chance to build that a little bit. And because I was selected by the members, obviously it wasn't unanimous, these things never are, but I had a group of supporters, and I had people, even if they didn't necessarily support me, had seen a democratic process happen. And so I had the chance to build some infrastructure, get some energy in there, and kind of do my things for, what was it, maybe 9 months in the end. Now, and if you look at some of the other seats in the county, there were, and this is not necessarily the party's fault, although perhaps things happen behind the scenes. But for example, Theresa May, who was the next seat, Maidenhead, retired late. John Redwood, Wokingham, retired late. And so both of those associations ended up picking from a short list of 3 that was imposed. Now, regardless of whether we think they were the right 3 or whatever, the fact is they were not democratically chosen. And so will the members, did the members have the full suite of options? No, they didn't. And even those candidates, regardless of people's views on the process, they had 6, 7, 8 weeks, right? What can anybody do with that in that situation? Especially with budgets being limited. So, and obviously there's councillors there and long-standing association members who would have wanted to be considered for those seats. So in terms of that buy-in of a democratic process and time, I think that's something that we need to learn from. So that's something locally. I mean, there was a bit of luck. Anyone who suggests that luck is not involved in these processes is for the birds. I am fortunate that some of my wards face red and some of my wards face yellow. So in my kind of historic bits of the Windsor seat, quite prosperous, is probably, you would say, economically centre-right, socially liberal. My flank that I was losing was going yellow. But then I had some blue-collar villages, and indeed Slough, which is multi-ethnic, and a university town in England Green. So I've got some red. And they had a good bum fight about who was best placed to beat me. So that is one.
And they split, the Liberal Labour vote was about equally split.
Indeed,
right?
indeed. And we did our best to kind of help that along. And the Liberal Democrats were most active in terms of literature and things, but actually Labour were probably better placed to beat me last election. So, there was a bit of that going on. So democratic politics is, there's, anyone who says that. But, more generally, the more apt question, we should change the way the candidate selection process works, so we see less of that in the future. But more generally, the problem was that we'd been in office for 14 years, and the state was spending 7% of GDP. We're letting 1 million people net into this country a year, most of whom the culture did not align with our values and who were fiscally negative. And every public institution imaginable fully digested the whole woke agenda, no matter who the ministers were. So I think on kind of the main axes of what you might want to see after a prolonged period of Conservative government, we didn't have. So we can talk about, we should have done this in Maidenhead or this in Woking, rather this in Windsor, but those seats should never, ever have been in play. And that is obviously the much more significant problem we had, rather than, have you got enough people to deliver leaflets, to be perfectly honest, Mark.
Yeah. What do you make of what's happened since politically? Because my sort of view was, and my line at the last election was, although I mean, I sort of went with the Labour supermajority line. Although a Labour victory looks certain, and they'll probably have a stonking majority, the only serious opposition to them is going to be from the Conservative benches, and therefore a vote for reform, other than in a small handful of seats, is a wasted vote, and will just make sure that Labour have an even more stonking majority, and that the opposition to the incoming government is thus weakened. I then sort of expected Labour to come off the rails, not as fast as they have, but as they came off the rails, for people to start to forgive us, to look back not necessarily on the halcyon days of Rishi Sunak, but to start to think, well, blimey, actually, the Conservative government, wasn't all bad, and this lot are a shambles, and for us to tick up in the polls. But if anything, we've gone further backwards, probably, in public opinion since last July. So we've gone from basically our worst ever result in a nationwide general election to our worst ever result in a local election, which, according to John Curtis's algorithm, had May the 1st been general election day, and if people had voted the same way, and you map how people voted in their areas onto other areas based on demographics, we would have got 15% of the national vote and won 17 seats. Doesn't feel like much progress, really, over the past 10 months. In fact, quite the opposite.
Yeah, well, in terms of the 24 election, we were using I don't think we were quite using the phrase supermajority, but we were using the phrase that, the government is changing anyway, right? Because there is this notion of change. So we were effectively conceding the national election locally before the CCHQ line had changed. So we were telling people that, the government's changed anyway. Windsor is not in the zone of where you determine who your government is. So vote for me to be a local MP. So and I ran an incredibly localized campaign to such a point that, in each of the villages, different leaflets, letters, messages based on their core issues. And then my predecessor didn't have I think in some ways it was unfair, this reputation, but he didn't have the reputation for being an active constituency MP. So I was very much running on the change that. And then when the supermajority stuff came out, we just doubled down on that, in that you may be, pissed off with us for whatever different reasons, but you want to hold this Labour government to account, and your values haven't changed. So that's the kind of campaign I ran, and I was always pretty clear, actually, that the Conservative Party at the last election, I thought, faced an existential challenge, given the scale of the failures. So you say, am I surprised? No, I'm not, because the failures were so deep-rooted and widespread and deserved that the idea that, you can just pick up a new leader and make a speech at the policy exchange where you say, oh, well, that was wrong, and everyone all of a sudden would go, okay, right, this party's under, new management, I think, is for the birds. And that's one of the reasons why I think we have to be a bit over careful about reacting to last week's result, because the problem isn't, Lotto, right, or even that person or this person. The party's problems are structural, deep, and endemic. And the point I'm trying to make to colleagues, and I think there is a split between, obviously this is broad brush, new colleagues, so people who came in July last year, and returning members, is that, this is an existential fight for the future of the Conservative Party's existence. So there has to be this sense of urgency. There has to be this sense of fighting like insurgents. There has to be this sense of we can't just wait, because what you just described is that effectively what's happened for the last however many years, the tide comes in, the tide goes out. What the 2024 wasn't, oh, the tide came out, okay, it's you survived, okay, this pendulum will swing. There's a fight on our hands for what the future of the right looks like in this country. And the reality is, if we get that wrong, or get 20% of the vote each at the next general election, say, we're going to have another Labour majority. So, this is pretty serious, right? Because the problems that face the country are not, they're not simple public policy issues about, the level of tax at the moment, or whatever, right? These are existential problems. So the party faces existential challenges, but we owe it to the country to get this right. So yeah, it's a tough time.
But how do you account for, and again, I'm not trying to throw brickbats at Kemi. I mean, whoever had become our leader was taking up a bloody difficult job after the July election. But so putting her aside, how do you explain the fact that we appear to be more disliked now than we were last July? All right, I mean, I'm measuring that just in kind of ballots in ballot boxes. But, again, had there been a general election on May the 1st, we would have done even worse. We'd be down to a tiny handful of MPs.
Well, I think some of this is like, it's a crisis in the confidence of democracy, right? So people generally have this view that it works, right? Don't like it, but it works. We were tired. We were ready for a change. That's the nature of being in power for a long time. And you vote for the other guys, right? It's quickly become apparent that the problem isn't really the Conservative Party or the Labour Party. The problem is that the British state's fundamentally broken, right? And that actually changing our leaders has not really made a significant change in public policy, right? So that becomes then a crisis of our system. It's much deeper. So I think what's happened is these guys have come in and they've made a lot of the same errors we have made, even though they criticize us violently for it, right? So, and maybe come at it from a different perspective. So if if we were on these calls a year ago, PopCon, your general way of talking, you might talk about the Treasury model or the OBR, driving public policy decision making in a way that is counterproductive, right? And you might have come at that from kind of the centre right point of view, free market mark. But the Labour Party is finding the same things are bloody true for them. I'll bet they might have different public policy goals. I'll bet they might have different emphasis of what they're trying to achieve. But ultimately, that's not a left or right problem, right? And it seems, some people at Number 10 get that. I don't have any insight into that, but if you read the papers, there's some of that. So in the instance where you conclude that, voting for different people doesn't change the public policy direction of the country, these people are just as bad as the lot. Obviously, then then there's a lightning rod to earth, which Reform are acting as, I think, at the moment, and none of that is Kemi Badenoch's fault. Where I would make a wider comment about our colleagues is that there is a lack of energy in the Conservative Parliamentary Party to take the fight to Labour. And Kemi is just our leader of the Parliamentary Party. I think that you could make plenty of reasonable criticisms about the job, and I have made some of them. I'll bet I've always done it by couching, by saying this is a top hospital pass. It is. But there needs to be a whole lot more energy from the whole of the shadow cabinet, and each and every single Conservative MP has to be there every day fighting for the lads. Now, if everyone's a bit morose and some of the older boys just disappearing, thinking, well, I'm the right honourable Sir this, I might take a non-executive directorship. What exactly is one person at top going to do? I don't think it changed much. So I think there's a much deeper problem, Mark, about our political system, and then first and then secondary, the Parliamentary Party needs to kind of realise that,
interesting. I want to come on to reform. I want to come to reform in a minute, but let me take some questions from our audience, which are around, I guess, the kind of plight of the Conservatives. Some are about you, so let me take those. Jeff Mitchell asks, are you a true Conservative or a wet? I can probably answer that question on your behalf, I should think. Of late, the last 10 plus years, wets seem to be in the majority in the Parliamentary Party. It's an interest. Oftentimes people say there's seems to be a colossal ideological gap between the ideology of the cohort in the House of Commons and the actual membership. Thomas Gordon asks, in the 1980s, before Jack Rankin was born, under Margaret Thatcher, you could explain what a Conservative stood for. What do you stand for? He asks you. Yeah. And then a more tactical one from Susan Renshall. Do you think the Tories should make quicker decisions on policies, as we seem to be drifting?
Okay. Well, there's a lot to go out there, isn't there? You did that deliberately so I can pick my favourite ones. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. I won't be so kind as the interview goes.
Right. So there's a few there, right? So is there a gap between the Parliamentary Party and the membership at large? Yes, there is. More importantly, is there a gap between the Parliamentary Party and the broad centre right in the country? Then yes, there is. So I talked a little bit about, I got asked this morning, actually, do you think, we elect the leaders from the members, do you not think that the no confidence vote should be through members? And I said the answer I gave was that no, the nature of parliamentary democracy is the leader must always command support in the parliamentary party. What we need to do is make the parliamentary party more representative of the membership and the broad centre right in the country, such that that becomes an academic question. And more democratic selections of our parliamentary candidates not only leads to better outcomes because we get longer at it, and then we've got buy-in of our members, but we, it's also important in bringing the parliamentary party round to our way of thinking. And I think that is one of the stunning opportunities for us at the moment, right? So you mentioned that, when you go backwards quite quickly, yes, we're only 26, but as a proportion of the parliamentary, we're quite large. Now, say the parliamentary party was to advance significantly, even into the majority territory. And obviously, I know that sounds remote at the moment, but should remain our intention. 2/3 of the MPs are going to be new, right? So if we can achieve true renewal of the party centrally and unlock, the kind of, CCHQ dead hand, and let members choose their candidates, then the Conservative Parliamentary Party will be massively different in flavour in the future than today. And not only will that affect our next Conservative government, but it will echo literally for decades. Genuinely, right? So that is something that we should keep a keen eye on. I would say it's not, even though I've exaggerated that point, it's not as bad. The gap isn't as bad as people would think it is, right? Because remember that the MPs gave the membership Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick as their final two, right? 1/3 of the MPs voted for each one of those. So 2/3 of Conservative MPs voted for one of those two people, right? Now, if you'd have said to any of us on this call, assuming that there's no journalists on here and everyone here is a card-carrying popular Conservative, if you'd have said to us before, the day after the general election, the two candidates you'd have had to choose between Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick, we'd have bitten your hand off. Right. So, I think the magnitude of that can be overplayed. But yes, there is renewal that has to happen. A couple of the other questions that I got there. Quicker policy, yes. So I think one thing that we've assumed, one thing we got wrong was we drifted away from our core values, and it's like, well, what are those? I not one of these people that has volumes of philosophical literature on my shelf. My conservatism is a bit more empirical. I grew up in a blue collar family. My parents came from working class backgrounds. My first memories of them going to night school to get the qualifications they needed to set up a small business that gave me and my brother life chances they could never dream of. And so, I was given kind of patriotism from the home. I was given a sense that family was important. But I saw the value of hard work, education, the ability to improve your life. In a part of the world where the Labour Party told you're working class, so you vote for us, and they peddled this politics of grievance and dependency on working class people effectively to keep you in your place. So, what kind of conservatism it's not too hard, right? We need people who graft to be able to keep more of the money. Part of the ladder of opportunity where our country is important and family is quite important. I'm not the kind of conservative who gets that tune from the 18th century and starts quoting, but I think that gives me, I think, enough grounding. The policy just needs to be quicker, right? And I've given this feedback, and I think it is fair, constructive feedback. In a world whereby the Conservative Party is unpopular, the Labour Party are in, and we can go and lick our wounds away and work out what the problem was and develop, a consensus and come forward with it in due course. That might make sense. If we're in an existential battle for the future of the right, and there is another actor who is good at getting attention, for me, it's naive to think that we can sit in dusty rooms with policy commissions. So I've given that feedback. The pace of the pace of policy development and the fight that we demonstrate in coming up with this quicker should improve. That said, I think Kemi has made significant interventions now on immigration policy. The deportation bill that we published last week, particularly derogating the Human Rights Act from immigration cases is an important thing to have done, as is pointing out some of the net zero nonsense. So on two of the biggest policy issues, Kemi has been clear on this already. But obviously, I think on more there's more to do. But right across the board, it needs to happen.
It's really interesting you say that. Before I come on to reform and what they represent, I suppose this is a segue into it. But I'm all, especially with my think tank background, I'm all for political parties having very well worked out detailed policies which are stress tested by think tanks and others, and you end up cracking and all of that. But what you just said, Jack, in the real world of politics, it's not just about policy, right? And we seem to, in the Conservative Party now, got ourselves into a little bit of an internal argument about whether policy should come out quick or slow. But in my view, it's also about basically stunts and presentation that indicate what you stand for, even if you haven't exactly worked out what the corporation tax rate should be under a future Conservative government, or exactly how quickly you're going to shift the income tax thresholds, right? But you might want to say, put a few markers down on immigration or whatever. So to give you a sort of example, these aren't in the economic sphere, which I'm more au fait with. But, Rupert Lowe has set up his private inquiry into grooming gangs. Okay, we've called for a national inquiry. We have a position on it. We raised that with Keir Starmer. But Rupert Lowe's actually set up his private inquiry. Now, there's all sorts of problems with it. You can't subpoena witnesses or whatever. But talk about putting a flag in the ground about that. I think Reform are also taking a private prosecution relating to that scrap that happened in Manchester Airport.
Well, talked about it. I'm not sure they are doing, but
okay,
yes.
They may have talked about it. Reform councils are now saying their councillors won't go on DEI training or climate change training. I mean, Farage is endlessly talking in front of, various auditoriums with all sorts of fireworks going off. There's a bit of pizzazz about it. But I wonder whether we've got to get out of this mindset that it's just about where we stand in Conservative policy documents. There needs to be a bit more kind of attention-grabbing, sort of media-savvy stuff that illustrates where we stand, even if it will be a while before we've got 10 Nobel Prize-winning economists to perfectly peer review every part of our fiscal policy.
Yeah, and so there's a few things here, right? So I use the analogy, I mean, forgive me, probably not that politically correct, but we're not in government, we're in opposition, right? So what do some of the people who have been very recent ministers do when the government makes a difficult decision, right? Even if we disagree with it, they go, well, we had this problem building up in our desk. We'd have probably had to. We might not have done A, but we'd have to have done B. It's been really rather difficult. Can we kick them about it? And you're like, we're in opposition, right? Just think about what they used to do to us. And I always use with shadow ministers who were ministers, the water analogy, right? So people hate the sewage going into our rivers. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing that's shared by a broad number of people in this country, that is not a good thing to happen, right? So what did the Conservative Party do? Well, it put monitors on all the outflows. And so if you look at a graph, it shows like this. Is it the reality of water spillage increases? No, it's just being reported and tracked than ever before. Right, okay. But as soon as you realize there's a problem, you measure the problem, these are good things to do, right? Because then you can talk about, well, now we need this capital program, we need to do X, Y, and Z over this many years, right? What did the Labour Party do? They used an opposition day to say, stop dumping sewage into waters. And we would make a speech, we would go, well, that's really rather difficult to do because sewage is a combined system. You either put, if it's capacity, you either put it in the rivers or pump it up into people's houses. If you ban us from putting it into the rivers, the operational implication of that is in people's houses. And then they'd put, when we vote against that, they'd put targeted ads in each MP's constituency and get them literally shit poured into their inbox. And people would campaign on this issue. And we would go, that's not fair. We're in opposition now. We should be playing exactly the same games that they were playing. We shouldn't be going, well, you need to spend £120 billion on the water industry. If you want to fund that sensibly through bills, you have to have a capital program over 50 years, kind of discussion. We're not the US Army going into Fallujah with our, attack helicopters and tanks. We are the guys with the Molotov cocktails, and that takes a like a world. If you start to internalize, not just say internalize that we're in an existential fight, it would change your behaviors. And that's kind of, I think, what we need to do in terms of how we're behaving in opposition. And if we did that, we would garner a lot more attention than what you say, and we would not leave a vacuum in the way, unfortunately, on some policy areas we had to do. You talk about some of those positions. So immigration, we've started to take some of them, right? So like suspending the HRA for immigration cases is actually quite a significant hurdle. So, you know, that's it's one step. It would be, I think, significant in numbers, but I think it's psychologically a step to make, right? My view is that we should repeal the Human Rights Act in its entirety. I'm sure I'm not alone in that call here, but to make that step forward is the kind of so I think Kemi's made the point. You know, the election's in 4 years' time or whatever it is. We don't need a full menu. I agree with that. We don't need a full menu, but we do need to know that we're opening an Italian restaurant that will be, you know, with good red wine, spicy food, right? So, you know, so I think that's the kind of movement we need to make. And I think the stunts are good. I'm Robert Jenrick's PPS. When we uncovered the two-tier justice stuff, one thing that great that we did is we projected the timeline of when two-tier justice will come into effect with a projector onto the side of the MOJ. You know, that cost us about 150 quid, right? You know, to hire a guy with a projector. You know, and ultimately the government caved, and it did it because of political pressure we created. We didn't necessarily have a full thought out position of what would you do with the Sentencing Council, what would you do with the Constitutional Reform Act of, was it 2003, 2005? Again, my view has been that, but that's, you know, we're not in a position where we're going to do that, but we can say the Sentencing Council is not doing what it's told, and the Lord Chancellor has been napping on watch. Here's some political pressure. You know, in a social media savvy way. So I take your point. I agree with you.
Let's touch a bit on reform. A few questions on that. John Wright asks, in my view, we need a showstopper strategy to cut through to voters and differentiate us from reform. Our strength is the economy. Do you agree? Isn't it now the case, us Ian Geldard, that in many seats, a vote for the Conservatives is actually a wasted vote, where reform stands the greater chance of winning? I mean, an interesting thing about the Runcorn by-election is that if 7 reform-inclined voters had instead voted for the Conservatives, Labour would have won the seat. And then John from London emailed in, are the reports of Jack defecting to reform true? Please ask him to stay. There you go. I've passed on John from London's message. But those are a few thoughts from our audience, Jack. But it's quite a phenomenon, this reform phenomenon, right? I mean, they did pretty well at the last election. They did spectacularly on the 1st of May. I mean, truly spectacularly, and are now topping the opinion polls. And I think in some of the latest opinion polls, albeit with that boost of having got those good results in Runcorn and the local elections, they're outscoring the Conservative Party 2-1. What do you make of this phenomenon? Are you attracted to it or repulsed by it?
So just to address the defection things, I was delighted to find on the front page of the Sunday Times last week that I had been put on defection watch, because it just meant I had to deal with lots of calls from journalists over the weekend. I'm happy to confirm to all your listeners that they are total nonsense without any basis in truth whatsoever. It's that people say politicians don't give straight answers. Was that straight enough, Mark?
That was a straight answer. Was it like to be on defection watch? You got like an ankle bracelet on or something?
Nonsense. And so let me try to explain why, right? So, and I hopefully in my introductory comment I alluded to it a little bit. The problem isn't, right, we had, just think about the Home Office under the Conservatives in the last few years. You might be able to tell me about the years, but we had Dame Priti Patel, we had Suella Braverman, and we had Robert Jenrick in the Home Office, probably for a consecutive period of what, 5 or 6 years, something?
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody think either of those three people like are soft, right, or somehow want mass migration of low-skilled migrants into this country? That's obviously not the case, right? So the problem isn't the ministers in office, right? That's not the problem, right? So replacing, you know, a load of Labour politicians or Conservative politicians with a load of new people, they'll have exactly the same problems. And in fact, because they'll be brand new and lots of them will be unvetted, etc., and they won't know Parliament, it will be even worse for them, in my opinion, in terms of the civil service running rings around and, you know, yada yada. The problems are much deeper and much more structural, right? So take immigration cases, for example, right? You have, you know, and you can start in many different places here, right? You obviously human rights legislation is gumming this up, right? The right to judicially review, you know, any immigration decision is obviously gumming this up, right? So you need to pull out of the wiring of the British state a lot of kind of constitutional law, which is now in place, which sits above ministers and MPs, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and take the judges, for example. It's pretty clear that there are a series of people who specialize in immigration cases who are actively motivated to let people into this country against the British people's democratic desire and their legitimate desire to live in their own country, you know, with a government that defends its borders. So you have to have we have to like fundamentally repeal lots of legislation, and then, you know, like the Crown, the judges. So since 2003 2005 kind of period, the Lord Chancellor no longer sits you know, he's no longer the head of the judiciary and appoints the judges. So that's now appointed by a Quango. So just in that space, there's quite a lot of constitutional law that needs repealing, and Quangos and this kind of managerial government that sits above elected politicians that need to change. Now, none of that will the Conservative Party needs to get itself in a position where that is our position across the board, in my opinion, because before we start to, you know, lay out what we're going to do, we have to work out, well, how do we make sure that, you know, ministers are accountable to Parliament, and ultimately the King in Parliament is sovereign again, i.e. return to our political constitution and not the legal constitutionalism that's set in since the Blair years. And the reason the Conservative Party fundamentally failed over the last 14 years because we didn't repeal that. So we're in office, but not in power. Now, I think there are people in reform who understand that frustration, but I'm not entirely sure that they have 300 people that can go about delivering that.
But they seem to be rather clearer. These aren't their words, Jack, but they seem to be rather clearer, or at least give the impression that they take a bazooka to the system.
Yeah.
Whereas we seem to give the impression that we've got a perfect scalpel here, but we're going to take a couple of years to work out the precise surgery needed. And it seems to me people are crying out for the bazooka approach rather than the scalpel approach, right?
They are, but like, you know, you campaign in, what's the phrase? Campaign in poetry and govern in prose.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we should be bigger about our ambitions and fight about this and have some, you know, move quickly. So I've talked about moving quicker on policy. I've talked about us being louder and in more of a rush. So I agree with all that. But ultimately, we are going to need, you know, the think tankers to point to your Olga to work through, and policy reviews to work through. Right, what is it? What legislation can repeal? Because they're going to hit a, you know, if they were in, they just hit a wall of treacle. And so if you think that the Labour Party, the Conservative Party failed to elect the Labour Party, and then they fail, and then support for the two incumbent political parties, you know, fades off a cliff, and there's a guy with a bazooka, and you elect him, and he can't do it. And what do you do then, right? You know, you've got like crisis of democracy time, right? So I think we have to be pretty careful about what we wish for. You asked me about another question. There was about effectively if the reform overtake us, are we in the way of getting rid of the Labour government? I think you can see from the last election cycles that the electorate are much smarter than anybody gives them credit for. So we talked about Berkshire. In Berkshire, we lost all our seats other than Windsor, as you say, but we lost some to the Liberal Democrats, Maidenhead, Wokingham, West Berkshire, and some to Labour, Reading, Western, Mid Berkshire, and Early and Woodley. If you look at what's happened there, the winning left-wing party squeezed the other one to beat the Conservatives. So, you know, I'm a Conservative politician. I will advocate for everyone to vote for their a Conservative candidate, but the electorate will do what the electorate's going to do, right? You know, markets are much more intelligent than the man at the centre trying to direct people, right? That's true in politics as is in you know, potato procuring, right? So you know that the public ultimately going to do what we're going to do. We just need to fight. We need to fight to get ourselves in the best possible position to be the main beneficiary of that.
That's a really interesting point. Are you? I'm not trying to put words in your mouth here, but are you suggesting that we should attempt to develop with reform the sort of relationship that exists between the Liberal Democrats and Labour, which is generally patchy, I'd say, but when they were both in opposition, they would typically compare notes, a bit different now that Labour's in government and obviously the Liberals are on the opposition benches. And in various areas, from local wards up to parliamentary seats, it seems to me there would be a tacit understanding that, you know, we're putting up a candidate on the ballot paper, but frankly, even the candidate himself is going next door to campaign for our party because he hasn't got a snowball's chance in hell. And therefore, Berkshire's quite a good example. You know, Labour pours its troops into West Reading and Early or whatever, and the Liberals pour their troops into Wokingham. And although there's no full stand down pact, and although I'm sure you're right, the electorate are wiser than we think about knowing which of the options on the ballot paper are credible, but it seems to me that there's a sort of tacit, possibly even on occasions warm working relationship between the Liberal Democrats, Labour, and occasionally even the Greens, whereas there is an incredibly hostile relationship between the Conservatives and Reform.
Well, I don't know about the too much about the interworkings of Labour and Libs. I mean, they stand full slates of candidates against one another, right?
Yeah.
I don't think there's any, you know, any kind of formal kind of pact or alliances, at least for the birds. We are going to have to, you know, we're conservatives, we're free marketeers. We should believe in competition. If we've got, you know, we shouldn't be shy about that. We should try to meet those head on. But you know, I don't think we should be particularly naive about this, and I don't think we should pretend it's new and shocking. We should be fighting to win a Conservative majority, of course we should. But why I say this isn't new or shocking is look at Scotland, right? The largely what happens in a lot of the seats in Scotland is that the unionists, there's unionist tactical voting of significant force.
Just to stop the SNP, yeah, whether you might vote, Conservatives might vote Labour or Lib Dem and vice versa.
So the fight is to be the viable opposition, and that doesn't mean we've got a tactic understanding with the Liberal Democrats or Labour in Aberdeenshire or anything. That means that we have fought to get ourselves in the best possible place to fight who needs to be replaced, and it's going to be pretty clear at the next general election that Labour Party are the people who are going to need to be replaced. So that's what we should be doing now. In Berkshire, when you talk about those things, you know, I don't think it's Ed Davies sitting in Keir Starmer's you know, dressing room, is it, about these things? It's what people do locally. You know, I know where my Liberal Democrat activists and Labour activists go, and they're not here doing sensible things. Conservative activists will do the same. CCHQ actively encourage it. In Berkshire, they will try to get the next generation. They'll try to get Conservative activists out of here into early and Monday. That makes sense. We will do that. And the electorate will ultimately make their decisions. I don't really think loads of us in Westminster sat around a big dining table is how this stuff is done. So, you know, I wouldn't want to encourage in that direction. We just need to give ourselves the best possible chance to take out Labour.
We've got about 15 minutes left, Jack. So there's one other issue I want to touch on, which we've covered a bit, but obviously you're part of the Justice team, where, you know, Robert Jenrick's probably been, you know, standout performing shadow cabinet minister, you know, great headline grabber all over social media, has derailed the government on the Census and Guidance Council, all of the rest of it. All round, and amongst Conservative activists, there's a topic or every Conservative home poll with kind of North Korean levels of approval rating, right? Amongst Conservative activists. You've touched on this a bit on justice. You mentioned in the legal system as well, the Human Rights Act and the rest of it. You touched on the quangos as well. Do you think our principal pitch to the electorate needs to be a bit more like the bazooka approach? That we can kill two birds with one stone. Firstly, we have a bit of a mea culpa here, that we're able to say, look, our fault and failings, where we tried to run the government along the train tracks that it was already set on. And it turns out you can't steer a train, right? You can make it go faster or slower. You can decide which signals it stops at, but you can't steer a train. And we've got to get Britain off the tracks that it's on. There's no point in changing the train driver. It won't change the direction of travel. Really, what we've seen at the July general election is more of a change of management than a change of government. And in consequence, here is a whole load of stuff we're going to change constitutionally. Lawyers shouldn't be determining immigration policy. Politicians should be. Judges should not be deciding that you can't send people home because in one case it was they had too many Facebook friends. That was actually adjudicated in court. I mean, it's just absolutely unbelievable.
Nothing can surprise you on those cases.
But then alongside that you've got to tackle these 400 or so quangos, basically get rid of them. If they've got functions that need doing, either privatise them or bring them wholly within ministerial control. And on the Sentencing Guidance Council, I thought what was interesting to me was, what's her name, Mahmood, the Justice Secretary. She seemed, I can't be sure, I'm just basing this on observing her reactions on the floor of the House of Commons, genuinely surprised that this guidance had been issued. She clearly hadn't rubber stamped it. She wasn't really across it. So, and then she sort of says, well, I'm going to show how strongly I feel about this. I'm going to use all of the tools at my disposal, which seem to amount to little more than writing a stiff letter. This is absolutely extraordinary. The Justice Secretary might very well want some experts to advise them on sentencing, but those experts should be directly answerable to the Secretary of State. And we should apply this across the board. The Environment Agency and Natural England seem to have more powers than the relevant government departments. Do you think that should be our rallying cry and might sort of shoot reform's fox? We're going to completely reset and rewire the way the UK works.
No. So, and I'll tell you why. I think there's two separate issues here, which we are in fact interlinked, but we have to be careful about this. So I believe exactly what you described there, that the reason the Conservative Party failed in government is that we're in office but not in power, because we accepted the Blairite constitutional setup, which created law that sat above law in Parliament. So, for example, if you were Secretary of State for Energy at the moment and you wanted to approve, say, one of the licenses in the North Sea, they will be getting legal advice that they will be non-compliant with their obligations under the Climate Change Act. So to do so will be illegal. So changing the Secretary of State for Energy would not change materially our North Sea energy policy. Now, you may think we should do net zero tomorrow, and I may think it's nonsense, whatever. That's not the point. Energy policy.
For the record, I don't think we should do net
zero. And neither do I think that either. But our energy policy should be determined in the House of Commons. A minister subject to House of Commons authority, ultimately the electorate. Right, that's where our sovereignty.
Repeal the Climate Change Act.
Well, indeed. So we should get rid of all those bits of legislation that impinge on that. Right. So that's definitely the Human Rights Act. I would argue it's the Equalities Act. It's definitely the Climate Change Act. But we shouldn't necessarily. We don't need to have the fight about our climate change policy. Really, the point is who's responsible for it. It's politicians, not lawyers. Right.
Yeah.
And then quangos are obviously, the next tier down, right? Because as soon as you see, ministers have to behave like this in these confines, then you can subcontract this all out. And if it works in a managerial kind of way, then that kind of works. So you're right, we should get rid of all that, right? We should get rid of all that on principle, but we just shouldn't necessarily campaign on it. And that's why I said no to your initial response. If you knock on doors, the average person thinks about politics about 20 seconds a week, right? If you knock on doors and you ask people what they think about politics, they don't even say potholes. They say that pothole there, right? People's concerns are the cost of living and immigration increasingly at the moment, right? So I think we've got to be careful about having an argument that the Lord Chancellor should be appointing judges, be the highest judge in the land, chair the House of Lords. We should get rid of the Supreme Court and be in the cabinet and talk about the King being sovereign in Parliament, And that should all, in my view, end up in our manifesto, and I'm sure we'll get there. But to the average person on the street, it's total nonsense, right?
Yeah, no, I get that. I mean,
the Conservative Party needs to get itself, it needs to be fighting, right, for its life, because we're fighting for our life. We need to get faster and smarter and savvier on social media and get more of us out there, getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, taking the fight to them. We have to develop this policy in the background. We have to do both, right? We don't have the luxury that a Farageist group does, which can just point at that and say it's all failed, because we're going to need like a proper plan to try to change this around.
It's really interesting you say that. I wasn't for a moment suggesting that the reaction on the doorstep is people
get rid of the EA. No,
yeah,
but just on the EA.
sort of, deep concern about the OBR's forecasting model, not come up once.
Just on the EA, Mark, I've got some villages that flood in my constituency. If I knock on those doors, Datchet, Horton and Raisby, no one talks about potholes, talk about flooding. Because if you flood, you don't, it's not river water that's in your living room, it's sewage.
Yeah.
Right. So if you get sewage in your living room every 10 years, funnily enough, what's your priority when a politician knocks on your door? It's flooding, right?
Yeah.
There are schemes that have been, I'll simplify this a little bit because, this isn't a flooding chat, but there are schemes that are written up. And one of the concerns about these schemes is that they don't increase biodiversity. And I said to the EA, well, I don't care about biodiversity. Like, not in the abstract, of course, we should have policy which, increases the state of nature. But on flooding schemes, I don't want there to be flooded pools which newts can lay their spawn in. I want my constituents not to have shit in their living rooms, right? And my constituents don't, and that's what they want, right? So when I campaign in those villages and say I'm going to sort your flooding issues out, they should be able to vote for me, and then me hold the Secretary of State to account and get the issue that is most important to their lives addressed. I asked the Prime Minister.
I agree with you.
I asked the Prime Minister a question at PMQs. I had a meeting with the Minister. The reality is the Prime Minister, nor the Minister is responsible for this, nor my constituents member of Parliament. That's outrageous.
Yeah.
So we need to frame this in a sense that what's really important to people's lives, because it's really.
Yeah, I'm completely with you. I don't think, let's bring back the Lord Chancellor because he's, got a swanky costume and, isn't that a great British tradition? But I do think, although people don't,
I do believe that as well. Yes.
Yeah, that happens to be true as well. Yeah, but I think it's more that people on the doorstep, if they're not mentioning the pothole, do sort of express the view that the whole system's broken.
Yeah, indeed.
That the whole system's screwed. That none of you seem to be able to get anything done. That nothing seems to work. I seem to be, however I vote, I seem to be governed by an elite that does the opposite. Those sort of memes and themes come through, I think. Now that doesn't mean that you have as your principal campaign slogan, we would abolish the Office for Budget Responsibility and go and have a more dynamic forecasting model. But I think it does mean that you can tap into the general disillusionment and increasingly hostility with the political elite.
And immigration is the obvious example, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We should just simply say that France is a safe country, and anyone who crosses to the United Kingdom and France should be viewed as illegal economic migrant, which is what they are. And so we should not have 500,000 people in asylum hotels around the country, right? And we should do anything to make that the case, right? So this can't be you use the phrase like a scalpel of, that notwithstanding this, that didn't quite work, let's try again. This should just be like, notwithstanding everything ever legislating for before, the Home Secretary is going to put all these people on Ascension Island, right? That kind of level of response. Because people see these in their communities. I've got them in my constituency. And then I've got people who are literally being evicted by private landlords, because private landlords can rent these houses, which then end up with not asylum seekers, but ones that have been processed through the system, whether that's the social housing, that's the council or the Home Office, I'm not entirely sure. But that's outrageous, right? Absolutely. And that comes to this deep sense of injustice. Yeah. Which is what you talk about,
Jack, we've only got a few minutes to go. What I'd like to do is to machine gun a few disparate questions.
I do that, sir.
So John Redwood asks, John, great to have you on the call. Thank you for joining us. And this touches on something that you just mentioned. An important part of winning back trust is showing we can run things well. We still control some councils. So shouldn't we help them to be model councils, delivering more for less? Plenty of scope to run a council that does what residents want. And therefore, you gave the particular example of asylum hotels. again, reform here. I mean, they might be going off half-cocked and haven't worked out the trajectory, but seem to be saying that, these reform councils are now going to use every tool at their disposal to try, litigation, lobbying, the whole lot, every legal tool at their disposal. But that's John's question on councils more generally. He didn't mention asylum hotels. Chris Penny asks, what the party needs is Mrs. Thatcher on steroids. Will the party leadership embrace this before its membership trains away? Cheryl Hennell says, good evening, Jack and Mark. Good evening to you, Cheryl. Please, can you provide a view on the Home Secretary's white paper today on restoring control over the immigration system and its relationship with the ECHR and the Refugee Convention? Thank you. John Strafford, sorry, I know I really am machine gunning you here. Yeah. This was more about your earlier points, Jack, about trying to get in more genuinely conservative candidates, I guess you could say. John asks, if the Conservative Party faces an existential threat, what is CCHQ doing about changing the party constitution so that members have more say in, for example, selection of candidates? And I'll leave you with this one, which is one of my favourites from Thomas Gordon. We were talking about getting the message across. Thomas says, politicians like three-word slogans. To solve Britain's energy needs, what about drill, dig, frack?
Right, where do I start? Well, I'm going to start with Sir John. So yes, we're right that competence needs to be at the heart of what we deliver, and that's why I think we have to be a bit careful of trying to out-bazooka Mr. Farage on some of the stuff. Ultimately, we're not going to be able to do that. I think we should recognise and internalise deeply the legitimate concern and anger, which he is a lightning rod for. But I think we have a responsibility to have proper plans in place to change the future as opposed to shout about it. And so John, I think, will recognise as well that in seats like his old seat, Wokingham in Windsor, there's a lots of economically prosperous centre-right voters that might not necessarily support a kind of rightward social drift on, but they will vote for us because their livelihoods are wrapped up in it. I've had a lot of kind of what you might call people who voted Liberal Democrat who regret that choice now because they've realised they've got a full-throated Labour Party in as a result. So we have to show competence. Local government is somewhere that we absolutely should run to, but it is complicated, and the reason it's complicated is that central government keeps shafting local government by giving it statutory obligations, but then not the money to deal with it. So the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead, which is the majority of my parliamentary seat, spends 80% of its money on adult social care, right? So the reality of that is that everything else has been squeezed to oblivion. So all those basic services you expect to get from your council. And when it comes to demand-led services like that, I'm not suggesting that there aren't efficiencies and reforms that could be used, but fundamentally they're between a rock and a hard place. And we structurally, I think, set up local authorities to fail somewhat. But that's something that we should develop a conservative answer to. Mrs. Thatcher from Chris Penny, I think we certainly need her energy. I think the whereas free market economics, is timeless. Obviously, she was a product of her time, and I don't think what we should do is kind of, we should learn that we should be core to our key principles, and we should understand how economies grow. That's the private sector, but we shouldn't just reheat her policies. We need the same kind of energy and the same kind of clarity of conservative thinking. Necessarily, not necessarily exactly. In the immigration white paper, I think this shows that our campaigning works, right? It shows that the government is petrified of the online right of reform and the way the Overton window is moving hard. The Prime Minister this morning said that the levels of immigration that we have seen is leading us to be a country of strangers, right? Just think about the Overton window shift for Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, who is a progressive North London lawyer, to say something like that. The Overton window is shifting hugely, and the Conservative Party has to get on the right side of that. One thing they've not mentioned is universities. A lot of our illegal migrants in this country are overstayers from universities that we would not recognise as such. right, who are effectively selling work visas and then they disappear into the system. So that is something that has been untouched. And we should also just be honest that their heart is not in this. So we need to hold them feet to the fire. But in terms of the Overton window moving in the right direction, I think this is fantastic because it allows us now to make more constructive arguments on the other side. I think I've already addressed the selection of candidates point, so I'm going to skip over that if I may, Mark. But on energy, right? And Sir John, who's on the call, has been very clear on this. Our British energy policy could be very simply described as unilateral industrial disarmament, to put it in 3 words. That is current policy, right? So whether you see, you know, what's happening with INEOS, whether you look at what's happening at Grangemouth, whether you look at what's happening for steel, all we are doing is exporting our emissions when we do this on a unilateral basis. My career was actually, you know, in the energy industry, and I've developed lots of renewables. There are good reasons to do some of this in good time, but the idea that you should do a unilateral pace, which just makes our energy costs much more higher than our competitors, is for the birds. And I'm hopeful that we can get the Labour Party on the back foot over this, because along with immigration, where obviously I've just said we've seen progress, this is something where I think the Labour Party is starting to wake up to the effects of. I think I don't think it was drill, baby drill. What was it you said? Drill?
It was drill, dig, frack.
Well, I think we should make the most of our, you know, indigenous resources, but that's going to mean get rid of the Climate Change Act first and foremost, because at the moment, the Secretary of State for Energy and the House of Commons is not sovereign over our energy policy. Has been put to a quango. And frankly, the lawyers will then tell the Secretary of State what it is. So it goes to the core nub of really, I think, what PopCon is really set up to do, that the King in Parliament should be sovereign, and whatever our policy disagreements are should be determined in the lobby of the House of Commons and at general elections, not by quangos or lawyers.
You've summed up our mission even better than I can there, Jack. Listen, we've overrun just by a few minutes, but that was really fascinating. Before I thank Jack, thanks to all of you who've joined the call. Just to point you towards the chat box, our next pop conversation is with Lord Peter Lilly. That's next Tuesday, back to our normal time of 7 p.m. And there's a link in the chat box. You can click on that link and register right away. Coming up shortly after that, I thought I'd let you know of our 2 further upcoming pop conversations. The first is on the 9th of June at 7 p.m. That's with Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp. And then at 7 p.m. on the 23rd of June, I'll be sitting down with the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice, Robert Jenrick. So we hope we're bringing some interesting conservatives for your delectation and delight, and for your cross-examination as well. Also in the chat box, there's a link to, Jack was just talking about the shift in the Overton window over immigration and how people are changing their tune. There was a great tweet sent out earlier by Kemi. We've put the link to that. If you're on X, please click on that and please share it. It's quite stunning what Keir Starmer was saying just a few years ago about this topic compared to what he was saying this morning. Jack, it's been a delight to have you in conversation for an hour. Always great to talk to you. And I think it's given a spring in the step to the more than 100 people we had on this call, that sometimes we look to the past and Mrs. Thatcher and how we turned things around in the 1980s. But it's incredibly heartening to see bright, new, younger Conservatives taking up their position on the green benches. Even if we are a depleted force at the moment, I think with more folk like you in Parliament, we've got a great deal to look forward to. So more power to your elbow. And thank you very much for your time, Jack. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Matt.
Good evening, everybody. Have a great night. Over and out.